they're the judges. They're the way, in traffic court, which was a whole different sting operation than Greylord. It was revealed that the chief justice of judge of traffic court was, he was the one that handled all the bribes and then distributed them all to the corrupt judges.
Hello, culminators. We have today, for a third triumphal culmination, Randy Barnett, distinguished professor of law at Georgetown University, and the person who has inspired me in more ways than he knows. We haven't even talked about it. We're not going to talk about it yet because it's a secret. But I will tell you that I've enjoyed reading his memoir about his time in Chicago, because we were there at the same time, although he was a much, much older man at the time. I've since caught up to him. But I now want to welcome back on the Dread Pirate Randy from you're not in Washington today, right?
No, I'm in Florida, at my home base in Florida.
Yeah, this is a whole new background.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about his new book, Felony Review, which I just loved. But, I'm a lawyer. Maybe I like reading about things that lawyers do in courtrooms more than other people. Randy, I guess people are going to have to understand why you're dressed like a pirate.
I think I'm going to report this to HR because I don't think that you're supposed to be commenting on my disability here. I've had a issue with one of my eyes that will resolve over time, hopefully, and it's just one of those things.
It's just one of those things when you get to be Randy's age,
right?
All right, I mean that's good enough. So I was very interested in reading Felony Review because of the way it sort of hooks up with A Life for Liberty, your comprehensive memoir. And I guess the idea is that this. Well, did you end up taking a bunch of chapters about practicing law, as that's what happened? Okay. Did you guys see the light bulb? So that's what happened. These were originally in the first book.
You know how long the first book is?
It is not a short book.
Imagine how much longer it would have been if half these chapters were included. So I took out the chapters on being a prosecutor. I left in the chapters on being a student prosecutor because that gives the audience some sense of what I went through on the way to being a prosecutor. And I had some great prosecutions. Some of my best war stories were when I was a student prosecutor, both in Middlesex County and in Cook County. But I had to take these chapters out, and when I did, I was able to blow them up to twice their length in order to provide background on the people I was dealing with, both my fellow prosecutors and the cops and the judges and the defendants and the victims, and what was the aftermath of these crimes, things that I didn't even know about until I researched it. And so I was able, and then I was able to take the time to draw lessons from my experience that were not in the original book because there was no room for them.
When I got to Chicago in 1985 to start at Northwestern, where you should have been teaching by then.
As we both know.
Actually, no, that was before. I was there before David got there. So
I failed to get the job at Northwestern around 89 or 90.
Right. That's right after I left. Everyone was talking about Greylord. And as a non-local, I had to get myself up to speed. This was in the day of newspapers, of course. So you had time to get up to speed. On the one thing, you couldn't just ask AI to get you up to speed. But on the other hand, you could sit down with a newspaper, and actually think about what you were reading, and eventually come to understand things. One of the amazing, so for people unfamiliar, why don't you just, non-Chicago legal personalities, what was Greylord?
Greylord was a federal undercover sting operation to investigate corruption in the Circuit Court of Cook County. And it was happening while I was a prosecutor in the Circuit Court of Cook County in a system that was rampant with corruption. and where everyone there thought they were immune from law enforcement
So there
doing
was a
anything about it.
so there was a time in not only in American history but during our lifetimes when urban Democrats were actually investigated for corruption by the federal government.
Yeah, at the instigation of the elected Republican state's attorney, in part. But it was a U.S. attorney that from the Northern District of Illinois that initiated this investigation, and it lasted for some years until finally its identity was blown with leaks, which was going to happen eventually. But it really took a long time before it was actually blown. And then the other thing was they had other sting operations happening at the same time that we didn't find out about until after Greylord was blown.
Which I guess is smart to compartmentalize in that way so that you don't lose the benefit. I
And
think,
and Ron, as you know from having read the book and having lived it, I'm able to name names in this book of all the judges because they are all adjudicated, and the lawyers too. They were all adjudicated, so I'm able to call them by
although a
their
lot of them
actual
are
name.
dead.
That's true.
Actually, there was one who was not adjudicated, right? One
Well,
who was never prosecuted,
yes, that's Ed, but he's dead.
but he's dead.
So I can name him too.
And you did. There was one person you didn't name, though, which I found very intriguing. After writing about him and after getting us used to the idea that you were really naming names, you said, by the way, I haven't used his real name here.
Right. I mean, well, the lawyer we're talking about, Eddie Jensen, passed away. He was the fixer, and he was also a adjunct professor at Chicago Kent College of Law, where I was on the faculty. He was very well respected. He got a glowing profile in a lawyer's magazine for how he never forgot the people that he came up with, and he was defending them in court as their lawyers. Yeah, well, I know why he was defending them in their court because they could all have dropped the dime on him. I'm sure he was defending them pro bono.
Right.
And
That was, yeah, you mentioned that. You mentioned that in the book.
And
It's also,
the one that I didn't identify is somebody who I prosecuted with, who ultimately went out in practice. And as he was leaving, and before either one of us got to the felony trial courts, I said, why are you going out? Why are you leaving so soon? We haven't got all the experience we have to get yet. And he said, well, Randy, there's a lot of money to be made out there, and I'm ready to make it. And it turns out what he meant, I didn't know what he meant at the time, but what he meant was he was going to start fixing cases because he had a connection with one of the corrupt judges on the north side of Chicago in a felony preliminary hearing court.
now,
And
I'm sorry.
but so the reason I didn't name this fellow, first of all, he was a good guy. I liked him. He was a friend of mine, a casual friend of mine. But the reason I didn't name him is because in researching the book, I found that he lost his law license, but he'd become a very successful real estate broker in Chicago. And this is some 45 years later. If he's got his life together, as all appearances he does, there's no reason to expose him, to the extent anyone in Chicago reads this book, back to the thing that he did 45 years ago, which he has grown out of. And so that's why I didn't name him.
That was very interesting, as was someone else you worked with and were friendly with until he seemed to change.
Yeah, well, I
He
think
seemed to
we're
he's
getting into spoiler territory here, Rod. So
okay. Okay. So that's true. I mean, and it's funny that you mentioned that because I was going to preface the question by saying the book has an arc, but it isn't the highest arc. It is somewhat linear, but this was a great moment in the book is when we learned something that we're not going to spoil for readers.
right. There we learned two things about two different people at the
Right.
end, and that we won't spoil that.
Now, one of these things to some extent explains the question that you might well ask, which was, how could all this be going on around you, and yet you weren't aware of it until it came out? Although you do explain that a little bit.
Well, we're aware of the corruption. I mean, and I was doing battle with it, and all the people that I thought were corrupt are the ones that got fingered in the probe, in part because I was the one that was fingering them, even though I didn't know I was. But everybody felt immune. And so there was no really thought that anybody, this is, they're the law, man. And there's no thought that they're the judges. They're the way, in traffic court, which was a whole different sting operation than Greylord. It was revealed that the chief justice of judge of traffic court was, he was the one that handled all the bribes and then distributed them all to the corrupt judges. That was a different sting operation than Greylord. And so and I guess the other thing I should mention, so people don't get the wrong idea, almost all of this corruption takes place at the lowest levels of the judiciary.
Right,
These
you're
are
talking
all
about traffic court here.
these are all traffic court or misdemeanor cases in which there are bond slips that can be used to pay off an attorney and split with the judge. If the judge adjudicates it in a way that's fair. Let me just explain what a bond slip is. A bond slip, you get arrested on a misdemeanor. Your $1,000 bond is set. You can post $100 to the circuit court. It's now in Chicago. There's no bail bondsman. It's handled by the government. Post $100. You get a receipt for that. It's called a bond slip. You go to court. If you show up in court, whether you're found guilty or innocent, you get your $100 back. But you can sign that sheet over to anybody, including your family or a lawyer. And so you have bond slip lawyers prowling the hallways saying, do you need a lawyer? Do you need a lawyer? Do you need a lawyer? You got a bond slip? Let me see your bond slip. Let me hear. And when he finds out you got a bond slip, you say, well, I represent you for the bond slip. So it'll be free. I'm not out of pocket for you, but I'll get your money. You sign the bond slip over to me. And that lawyer in that courtroom has a pre-existing relationship with that judge. And when the judge sees that lawyer come up, he knows that that's the lawyer that's collecting the bond slip that he's going to split with the judge, and now the judge will rule favorably towards the lawyer. This was how it was done routinely around the city in front of the corrupt lawyers. But that didn't affect the felony trial courts, except when something did. That was actually a different investigation, but that was very unusual. At the upper ends of the system was not corrupt in that same way. It was corrupt in other ways. The who do you know way, the connections kind of way, the favor bank kind of way, the what comes around goes around kind of way, but not in a monetary corruption kind of way. There's different kinds of corruption.
And one of the things that is fascinating about the book for someone who never worked in a prosecutor's office is your description of how a person goes from law school. And of course, it's unusual to go from Harvard Law School to a prosecutor's office, much less a prosecutor's office in Cook County. But starts out really at the bottom of the food chain. You had a little bit of a leg up there because of making a good impression as a student clerk or a student prosecutor, all the way up to trying felony capital trials. You had a conflict at one point with your beliefs at the time concerning capital punishment. Want to talk about that a little bit?
I am such a contrarian, which I freely admit. That's one of the themes of my first book is the fact that I am.
It comes across in this one too.
Yeah, and so I'm such a contrarian that when I was in college, where everybody was liberal and smoking pot, and it was anti-war days, I was pro-death penalty. I was a conservative pro-death penalty. I became a libertarian and then believed that the death penalty was intentional homicide and therefore was murder. And so I had moral objections to the death penalty. When I went into the prosecutor's office, that's what I held, which was if anybody had known about this, it would have inhibited my rise to the top of the prosecutor's food chain. However, it turns out somebody did drop a dime on me. When I was a law student, I confessed it, or I admitted this to a lawyer who was not even in the prosecutor's office at the time, and he told my supervisor, my wing supervisor, that this had happened. I found this out years later after I left the office that this had happened, and the wing supervisor, who was named Mike Vaccaro, who ultimately ended up being chief of the criminal division, he said to this lawyer, he's young, he'll grow out of it. And even though he knew, he actually, pushed me up the promotion chain just as fast as I could go, never really held it against me. So therefore I was like, again, but I did have a problem because I had as you say, I had a capital case that I had earned the right to try as a third chair in a courtroom because I had won the motion to suppress by defeating Jenner and Block, yay, The one law firm I interviewed with as a law student who didn't give me the time of day after that.
They didn't give me the time of day either.
Yeah, and I so kicked myself for even interviewing with them because I didn't want to work for a law firm.
I know. It like you're in Chicago. You have to. You know.
And they had a criminal pro bono practice, which is why I interviewed with them. And as a result, I went up against them. They're criminal pro bono people. And I beat them in a motion to suppress that was extremely difficult. So that gave me the right to second chair that capital case. But since I was opposed to it morally, I had a moral dilemma. And I confessed to the trial judge. It's one of the judges I dedicate the book to. I dedicate the book to two circuit court judges, John Crowley and Eugene Pincham, and to all my fellow state's attorneys from whom I learned so much, which is true. And so I went to Gene Pincham, who was a very pro-defense, liberal, African-American, former defense lawyer who I knew since I was a law student at clerking. And I said, I got this moral dilemma. What should I do? Should I do this? He goes, of course you should do that. Yeah, absolutely you should do this. It's a great opportunity for you. You should actually try this case. You earned it. I said, I know, Judge, but what about this moral dilemma? He said, well, then he confessed to me something. So I'm confessing something to him that's a career breaker here. Then he confesses something to me that's a career breaker for him if I were to say it. And what he says to me, it says, don't worry about it. I'm never going to fry these boys.
And I was about to say, you said they never held it. They never held it against you. Your supervisor never held it against you with the Caro. The state of Illinois never held it against anyone for that they were sentenced to death because they ultimately everyone ended up getting clemency.
Right.
In this period.
Because of a corrupt governor who was trying to buy some peace and quiet from the opposition by giving everybody commuting everybody's life sentence to, including a guy I helped put on death row by taking the confession from him, which is the way the book opens. The confession I took from him. He got the death penalty, but his death penalty was commuted to life imprisonment. But let me just finish the contrarian story. So then I go into legal academia, where now I'm with all the lefties and liberals, right? And building up to my book, The Structure of Liberty, Justice, and the Rule of Law, in which I basically now come out in favor of the death penalty. So I am more or less in favor of the death penalty now, even though that's contrary to the environment that I'm in. It would have been helpful if I had felt that way back then, but it ended up not hurting me at all.
I guess I have to ask, how could a libertarian, notwithstanding the woolly thinking of so much libertarianism, ever trust the government to execute a person when it's so manifestly incompetent at so many things?
I think that's a serious question, and I haven't written a lot about the death penalty. The point I make about is that if somebody who's guilty is put to death, and not only just guilty of murder, but guilty of being a true threat to the community as manifested by their behavior. If that person gets put to death, that is not an injustice.
It's a utilitarian result.
No, it's an act of public safety. It's justified not as by retribution, but because it actually protects the community that has no obligation to pay for a lifetime of room and board to protect itself from this person who's that dangerous.
And not only room and board, some of these people require these immensely elaborate security apparatuses.
I tell the story of Henry Brisbane in the book, and the I-57 murderer who was a grisly murderer. I won't talk about the details here. You can read about him in the book. I didn't prosecute him. Ficarro is the guy who prosecuted him, but although he does play a role in one of my anecdotes, but he was a guy who was so stone cold, such a stone cold killer. He vowed he would kill as long as he was able to, and one way he stayed off death, he avoided the death penalty, is he kept killing in jail, so they kept having to put him on trial again, and until he finally died. So anyway, so I distinguish between whether it's morally justified if somebody who fits this description gets executed, and how trustworthy the system is in order to do it. And that it's a separate question of whether we can trust the system than it is should we condemn this as a moral outrage or a moral offense, which I think it's not.
Right. Right. Exactly. I mean, it's two different discussions. Whether it's just and just slash moral. And to me, the only, no one asked me, but the compelling argument against it is the question of innocence. Now, DNA has come a long way, not all the way, but come a long way to resolving a lot of then you have the confessions, and
Oh, can I say just one more thing? And that is
yeah,
that case never went to trial that I was asking about. It pled out. And the reason it pled out is because Pincham would never let on in public that he wouldn't give the death penalty. So he was able to extract 80 years in the penitentiary for these two offenders who hogtied and killed a father and mother in front of their children. This is an African-American family that gets taken off the street when the dad goes out to buy something at the convenience store, taken home, shot in the head in front of their kids. They pled out to 80 years in the penitentiary because Pincham had the death penalty held over their head. Once we'd won the motion to suppress, then we got that plea, and the case never had to go to trial.
And once you take the death penalty off the table, you've lost leverage.
Yep. And Pincham wouldn't do that. But that's what he can. But I thought it was so interesting, and it's one reason I dedicated the book to him, is that he trusted me and confided in me as a prosecutor, and he didn't like prosecutors that much.
No, right. His background was really all defense.
Right. And he was a Democrat, liberal Democrat mainstay of Chicago, ran for mayor at one point after I left the office.
Now, that does cause me to ask a question that is absolutely foreign to my experience, but you hanging out in chambers with these judges, what the freak? What is, I mean, we listen, everyone knows. The judges know the prosecutors, and the judges know the cops, and that's why you plead. Not because they're corrupt, but because certainly, when it comes to the cops, and this is not as true in a Chicago as it is in a small town where the same 12 cops rotating through traffic court all the time, judge isn't going to say, no, he wasn't speeding, but you're really casually hanging out with those judges quite a bit. Is that pretty common across different systems?
It's very common. Now that it's the first time in all the interviews I've been doing, it's the first time anybody's asked me that question. So good for you. It's really common for prosecutors to become close to a judge, the judge they're assigned to over a period of time. Not everybody does, but it's not uncommon that they have they're the judge's favorite and they have a favorite judge. I was able to establish a rapport with two judges, John Crowley and Eugene Pincham. Pincham I met when I was a law student, and he came to Harvard Law School, and he gave in our trial advocacy course and taught us how to do closing argument. And he took me out to drinks with his wife when I was a law student. Then I ultimately ended up in front of him when he was a felony trial court judge. John Crowley I met out in the West Side in the misdemeanor courts, and he taught me how to be a prosecutor. He taught me bullshit. He taught me what bullshit was, a bullshit charge, a bullshit complaint.
The felony review level, the felony review procedure that they had. Do they still have that in Illinois? In Coke?
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't think it's structured exactly the same way as it was when I was there, but yeah, we should talk about what felony review is. It's the original. The original Innocence Project is what it is. It keeps innocent people out of jail. A lot. But I got friendly with both these guys, and John Crowley, I used to drive him to work because he liked to have court personnel drive him to work. He lived he lived on Lakeshore Drive, and he came to my wedding in '79.
Which block was he on in Lakeshore?
Oh God, he was like around Addison or Belmont, somewhere.
All right.
Actually south of Belmont, but I was on Irving Park Road, so I was just like 2 exits up Lakeshore Drive from him, and I could pick him up as then we headed out to Harrison and Kedzie, which is where the West Side courtroom was. But here's the thing: when I talked to both of these judges, I didn't talk about my cases with them.
Right.
I didn't talk about I just talked to them about their wisdom about stuff. Now, I have to say, Judge Pincham would talk about. He would bring up cases on the call and tell me about what he thought about these cases and what he thought about the lawyers. And he was very hard on defense lawyers too. That's one of the things I learned, that if you were a former trial lawyer and you became a judge, it's very frustrating because you have to sit up there and see defense lawyers doing a bad job all day long, and you can't say anything and you can't do anything about it, and it's so frustrating.
And let's point out here, and look, basically a federal litigator, and I had the good fortune of going to a better law school. And, food chain wise, nothing to complain about. A lot of the people in criminal defense are doing that work because it was all that they could do. There's a gigantic quality variation among criminal defense lawyers.
No question. No question. And some of the criminal defense lawyers are only qualified to plead you guilty. That's their job. The only thing if you have to,
some of the best paid ones seems to do that and do quite well at it, actually.
Yeah, and if they can't plead it out, they'll send it to somebody else. Let somebody else try the case because it takes too much time away. They can make too much money with pleas than it is being on trial for 2 or 3 weeks. But where were we? This was a digression.
About you had mentioned that you were dedicated the book to these judges,
right,
who had done so much for you, and I had asked you the question about your relationship
hanging out with them, right? I remember. One story, and this is not really an answer; it's just another anecdote.
That's okay. Anecdotes are people. I'm always told that this is the content people like best: lawyers telling war stories.
Well, this is a book of war stories.
Yes, it is,
and this is going to be a war story podcast. So I was sitting with Judge Crowley on the West Side, and I would sit in his very, very Spartan chambers. This looks like something out of Hill Street Blues. Bare walls, metal desk, wooden chairs. Really just something out of The Wire. Actually, I'm now rewatching The Wire, and man, is that show dead on. The only show that's dead on is The Wire. Anyway, back to this.
You didn't have to write to the producers and tell them
not about The Wire, and that was like those. I wrote those letters. What Ron is talking about is that I reproduce at the end of the book as a postscript the 8-page single-spaced letter I wrote to the Bochco and Kozel, who produced Hill Street Blues, telling them how badly prosecutors have been portrayed, how inaccurately they've been portrayed in popular media, and I did a whole history of the portrayal of lawyers on television.
It's like a Wikipedia article on
which they were bemused, I would say, about. I reproduced their responses too from Mary Tyler Moore, MTM Productions. But anyway, I'm sitting on the West Side, and I'm sitting and there's all of these political interference, political fixing, all this stuff going on. And one of the things that Crowley told me was, he says, and he was an old Irish judge with a shock of white hair and a very cantankerous guy. He threw prosecutors out of his courtroom. He would throw files at the prosecutor if he didn't like the case. But he said, Randy, I get lots of phone calls. See that telephone? I get lots of phone calls saying the mayor has an interest in this case. And you know what I always tell him? I say, great, you have the mayor call me. And in all these years I've been on the bench, the mayor has never called me. I thought that was interesting.
That was definitely a literary moment in your life. You said something, the one point where if I weren't too lazy to get up from where I was reading, I would have marked it in my book, but there was no pen nearby. You had come to the conclusion after a little while of doing this, I guess a few years, that anyone who tells you they can tell, anyone who claims they can tell when someone's lying is full of shit.
Yeah. You know why? Because
that was so compelling to me, because I'm always, and you see this all the time on the X, the crazy eyes. You can always tell the crazy. It just looks like people's eyes. Everyone looks the same.
Well, here's the thing. I think good liars really can lie well, and honest people can tell the truth very badly. And so,
oh my goodness, yes.
So that's the problem, because you can have an honest person who's stumbling and bumbling and doesn't tell a story very good, and you have the liar who's smooth as silk and just very sympathetic.
I had a client lose a case on me. He lost it by not being able to tell his own narrative, and the judge, who was former FBI in the Southern District of New York, she took over the questioning. She couldn't. Oh, and my client was former Secret Service. All right. So she's like, how could you not? How old were your kids then? Like, I'm trying to, I'm putting it in front. he was ultimately found not to be credible, even though the other guy was absolutely lying. The other guy was for sure. I mean, he'd been demonstrated to have been lying. But also on the whenever I coach witnesses, I don't coach when I prepare witnesses
We know what you mean.
for a deposition. I tell them this about the truth. I said, remember that probably the best liar in our lifetimes was Bill Clinton, and he couldn't even get away with it.
Right.
And that's part of explaining to them, and this is much more true in the 21st century than it was when you were practicing. There's a record of everything. There's a video of everything. There's always a tweet. And all the digital documents, and the documents were not a big part of your criminal practice, but in my civil practice, documents are everything. And like when I started out doing document review at Case Scholler in antitrust cases, in the late 80s, theoretically, you could have a photocopy of something, and it might be the only photocopy of that existed, or in other words, it might be the original. Today, forget it. You can't destroy You cannot destroy a document unless you're Hillary Clinton.
Right. Well, I guess one of the things that I really want to say is that this is an example of something I try to do in the book. In other words, in addition, one of the things that, because I was academically inclined, I try to put all of that on the shelf and just be a real prosecutor and not be an effete guy that that wasn't down with the system, down with what was going on. But I couldn't suspend all of my powers of observation. And so I would be analyzing what's going on and drawing lessons from them. And in felony review, I'm able to tell people, share with people what I learned and some of the lessons I drew from it. And for example, what kind of lawyer you want would be different if you're innocent or if you're guilty, or
that was fascinating.
Or why is it that people talk to the police or confess to the police, and there's several different reasons depending on the individual. I tell that story. There's a number of stories that lessons that I draw from my experiences which is what pulling those chapters out of A Life for Liberty allowed me to do, and it made it a much more fun book to write.
But it was too short, Randy. We wanted more. We wanted more. You should have written more letters to more producers or something. I kind of blew past the cultural context, something you just alluded to here. For people who are, I don't think there's anyone who listens this far into a ColemanNation podcast who doesn't know who Randy is. But Randy's a law professor, and no, he's not effete, but he is a Jewish kid like me. Probably better at sports, but otherwise, a really unusual track into being a prosecutor. And yet you ended up exactly where so many Harvard Law School graduates end up. It's amazing to me that you were able to put aside you didn't really entirely put it aside, because you were busy with your little gang of anarchists, which could be a very dangerous thing to be in Chicago. I don't have to remind you. But wasn't that kind of what drew you back into? In other words, you were publishing stuff in the Libertarian Review, not necessarily legal scholarship, but you're doing a lot of thinking, which is not something we associate prosecutors with doing.
Well, I was doing a lot of repressing, is what was happening, and so let me say how I got to be in that area in the first place, and that was because of a television show. I'm a child of TV. I love TV. I still love TV. We love about 2 hours of TV a day. Two special shows every night.
That letter makes that very clear.
Yeah, you should buy the book just for the letter. When I was 10 years old, a television show came on called The Defenders, which was about a father-son criminal defense team in New York, played by E.G. Marshall as the father, and Robert Reed, who went on to be the father in the Brady Bunch, as the son. And it was very gritty. It was very realistic. It was shot on location in New York in black and white. And it was about the practice of law. It was about the practice of criminal law. And one reason why no one has seen it or heard it since then, although you can buy season 1 on Amazon on DVD, you can't buy the rest of it. One reason nobody has is because it got locked up in rights for all these years. So it's never been syndicated, which it really should be. It's really a shame. Now, we had Perry Mason in our house. every Sunday. But that didn't make me want to be a lawyer because that was about solving murders. This was okay. This was a show about being a lawyer and all the
Actually, wasn't
problems
it?
that arose.
It was at least, I guess, some murders were solved. They were mostly demonstrated to have not been solved by the prosecutor.
Really? I think I thought every week the guy stands up or on the witness stand
Oh, that's
saying,
right. And
"That's
then
right, I did it."
a witness ends up acknowledging that he's the one who did it.
Right.
But whoever it is, it's never the defendant.
No. He had nothing but innocent defendants except for one. They gave him one guilty one near the end because it was a joke that he never had anybody that was guilty. But that didn't make me want to be a lawyer. The show did. And so then when I go to Northwestern and I start. And I was a very conservative, politically conservative kid because my dad was politically conservative, and I went to Northwestern and I became a libertarian and started getting active in libertarian intellectual stuff, which is the subject of the first book, A Life for Liberty. I did, and I became a philosophy major. I thought about not going to be a lawyer. Why? Because it turns out the through line of my entire career has been my concern with justice, which is the reason I wanted to be a criminal lawyer. It's the reason I wanted to be a prosecutor. But it's also the reason why I thought, well, I didn't even, in Calumet City, I never heard of philosophy. It turns out there's the subject matter you can study, and it's all about what justice is. Maybe I should be a philosophy professor. But for reasons I explained in my other book, I decided to stick with my original course, go to Harvard Law School. And notwithstanding the fact that my classmates are saying, aren't you little concerned you're going to be wasting your degree by being a Cook County prosecutor? My response was, I went to law school to do what I want, not to do what I don't want. And I certainly don't understand why anybody would want to be a law firm lawyer or on law review or a law clerk or any of those other things. So I just want to be a DA, which is what TV showed. So I get out and I do that, but I repress all of my intellectual interests, which by this time are pretty ample. I have a book published already called Assessing the Criminal. It was an anthology that I put together with a classmate of mine of work, original work on criminal justice theory. So I had all these intellectual pursuits, but my goal was to be able to go up to a prosecutor and shake their hand and say, I used to be a prosecutor and mean it. Not that I played the part, not that I was a dilettante, but I was actually a real one. So for 3 years, I'm repressing all of my intellectual interest. Then I get invited by the Institute for Humane Studies to give a week-long lecture on a libertarian legal theory. And so I took a week off vacation
And
pay.
you don't mean one that just felt like a week long, but one that actually was a week-long series.
It was riveting. It was for those students. It was riveting, but it was the first time they had it. And so I took a week of vacation time, and I went to Northwestern, hung out in the library, and wrote my lectures. And then I went down a week at the University of Dallas, and I gave them. But because I'd been repressing all this stuff so long, it all burst out, and I couldn't sleep. I was up constantly for 3 days. And finally, near the end of the week, the guy who was organizing the conference says, maybe it's time for you to leave the practice of law. So then I went into the job market right away. I said, maybe you're right. I went into the job market, could not get any entry-level job, and then continued for my final year, my fourth year as a prosecutor before I got a research fellowship at the University of Chicago, which enabled me to upgrade my credentials to the point where I could get a teaching job.
So in other words, you still had not been an appellate clerk, which is absolutely required. But you had Harvard, which not everyone in the Midwest has. You were open to going anywhere at that point, right? As a law professor?
Yeah, I was.
You wouldn't have had to stay in Chicago.
No, but I had Harvard law degree. That's the only thing I did right educationally. But then I had a article published in Ethics, which is a peer-reviewed philosophy journal at the University of Chicago. And by the time I went on the market, I also had an article published in the American Journal of Jurisprudence. So I had 2 publications. Nowadays, 2 publications are almost required to be an entry-level candidate. In those days, it was exemplary.
But there weren't as many journals.
Well, even law review articles that you just didn't, you went into teaching, you had a job talk, which was a talk. It wasn't a paper. Now it's got to be 3 published articles. So I had 2 publications, and that was and one of them in a peer-reviewed journal, one of the top 2 philosophy journals in the world. And so that I had that going for me. The problem was that my articles were in criminal law, and I was going into the market as a contracts professor, and that created a problem on the market. But nevertheless, I got my foot in the door, and it all worked out for the best. I am where I have my dream job, and I am where I hope where I'd like to be.
And you made the subsequent move, as you described in the earlier book, from contracts to constitutional law.
Right. And that's But doing this book on criminal law kind of brought it all back. When I first started teaching, I taught evidence. I taught criminal law a couple times, but I mainly taught evidence. And as I was teaching it, I kept dreaming I was back in the courtroom. And then when I stopped teaching evidence, I stopped having that dream. But when I was writing felony review, I started dreaming about being back in the courtroom again. It was that overpowering to reimmerse myself in all the records that I had kept. I saved police reports. I saved my felony. Oh, should we talk
Really?
about what felony review is? Because
Did
we never said
you're
what
right.
it
You only
was.
described it as the Innocence Project, but you didn't explain how it worked.
Right. So in Cook County, we had this system, we still do, and that is that the Chicago police cannot bring felony charges against any individual without the approval of a Cook County state's attorney. And we work for a different agency than the Chicago police. The Chicago police work for the city of Chicago. We work for the county of Cook. We don't have the same bosses, but there was a deal that was struck between the offices that would be a requirement, and as a result, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office had to set up a full-time unit that did nothing but respond to police stations in order to evaluate cases where it was requested that felony charges be placed. And when you show up at one of these police stations, first of all, your office is in a police area headquarters. You have a squad car, your own squad car, and you show up to one of these district police stations, and your job is to interview the witnesses, interview the cops, and if possible, interview the accused, which means taking confessions or taking their, pleas of innocence seriously. And as a result, we had a 60% approval rate and a 40% disapproval rate. And our individual approval
Approval, in
stats,
other words, 60% of the cases that came in from the cops were approved for prosecution.
right, and 40% were declined. And our individual stats were kept. We kept logbooks of everything we did, and I have my logbooks, which is why I was able to write the book. And we turned them in once a week, and then they would keep track of our personal statistics to ensure that we weren't approving too many cases. So our job was to screen out cases that could not be proven at court, and to anticipate, also very importantly, to anticipate what a defense attorney would say about a case and do what we could to neutralize that in the police station in the middle of the night before charges are even brought. So, for example, in one of the cases I talk about, there was the issue that I had a guy who confessed to killing this guy with a shotgun. And so the question is, and he, according to his story, he threw the shotgun away up on a railroad embankment that was running in front of the Robert Taylor homes, where the elevated train runs. And so I asked the cops. I said, "Did you go out? Did you go look for the gun?" Well, they said no. Well, why not? Well, because it was never going to be there. I said, "I know it's never going to be there. The question is, did you go look for it? One of these days, you're going to be on the witness stand. They're going to ask you, 'Officer, did you go look for the gun?' And you're going to be able to say, 'I did,' but you didn't." So they said, "Okay, well, if we have to go look for it, you have to go with us." So I said, "Okay." So we drive out. It's in the middle of the night, so the orange sulfur lights are lit like on the Dan Ryan Expressway. And to get up to the one story up to where the railroad tracks are, we had to pull a squad car next to it, and then we climbed up to the hood and then the roof of the squad car, and then to get up to the embankment.
And you're in a suit and tie, right?
I was in a sport coat and jeans.
Okay. All right.
But my jeans, when I went up there, split in the crotch trying to get up to the top,
which is not something you would experience too often in your life. Being a wiry guy. Because I mean, guys like me, you always got to keep a spare pair. I got a spare pair of pants right there on the other.
I never knew this about you, Ron. I don't know that anybody ever knew this about you until this moment.
No, it's not an everyday occurrence, but the possibility exists.
But when I took the court reporter statement from this guy with the court reporter, I had to keep my legs crossed because my white briefs were showing through my crotch. That's a war story in felony review. That's the kind of stories I tell.
It really was great. I really enjoyed it. And do you think we'd be better off if a couple more law professors had some experience in the in the trenches?
For sure. But you have to be able to do both things. You have to be able to write and do the scholarship that merits you a position as a professor and not a clinical professor. Clinical professors do have the experience, by the way, and there are many. And I was the beneficiary of an extremely innovative clinic at at Harvard, which had just been put into place, where it was a 9 hour one semester 9 hour course that consisted of legal ethics, trial advocacy done by NITA, National Institute of Trial Attorneys, instructors, and clinical experience in the criminal. I was in the prosecutor's wing of this. Mostly they were defense lawyers, but I was supervised by a former AUSA, Nick Littlefield, who ultimately ended up being an aide to Teddy Kennedy, and wrote a book about Kennedy. And so I had this trial advocacy experience. I had clinical experience under supervision, and then I had legal ethics experience from a radical left-wing lawyer. And so law school actually prepared me, Ron, for the practice of law.
Yeah,
I was more prepared for the practice of law than my DePaul, Loyola, University of Illinois colleagues.
But were you as well prepared for the bar exam?
Apparently.
Because, you know, I mean, a lot of your students at Kent, I mean, look, I taught one semester as an adjunct, and I didn't enjoy it one bit. But it was a school more like Kent than like Harvard. And what I realized was, this was not going to be the paper chase. Okay, this was not. These kids wanted to know what's going to be on the exam, and you know, what do they need for the bar exam?
Well, like, this is one of the themes of my first book, which is the problem I had at Chicago Kent my first year of teaching, because I taught it like I was Kingsfield, because I was teaching contracts like Kingsfield, and right. Man, oh man, did some of them hate my guts.
Yeah, so that was part of what I didn't like. The other part was I didn't like the grading. I just don't have that. So you know,
nobody likes the grading, Ron.
I don't mean I didn't like the process of grading exams. I didn't like having to fail people and that's the job. You have to evaluate the students, but it's not the job now, though, right? Doesn't everybody just graduate with A's?
Well, at Georgetown, nobody really writes a failing exam, and if they do, it's so obvious that you don't feel bad about it, because this person obviously didn't pay any attention to anything, and they're insulting you. But that happens. that happens once in a blue moon. Generally speaking, our curve, which is a mandatory curve, reflects the actual performance of our students at Georgetown on the exams.
Randy, we could do this for hours, I'm sure. Maybe we will next time one of us is in the other one's neighborhood.
And hopefully somebody has watched all the way to the end.
Oh, I'm sure that someone has, especially because probably somebody is listening in their car, and they don't want to move their hands off the steering wheel.
Buy Felony Review. Buy the book.
Buy the book. Buy the book. It is fun. And Randy, for a law professor, you write well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Because you're not generous with your compliments. So I do appreciate when you compliment me. I take it very seriously. I really do.
Well, you should, because yes, I am a kind of a ball buster. It's been great hanging out again.
You're a Marty Reddish protege. We've already established that in a previous podcast.
Great talking to you, Randy. Let's talk again soon.
Okay, anytime, Ron. And by the way, just keep on doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
I avidly follow you.
What the hell is it that I'm doing? Well, I will tell you that whatever it is I'm doing,
you're an advocate. You're an advocate for truth, justice, and the American way. And for our Constitution, and for the rule of law, and for the Jewish people,
Thank you.
And for the state of Israel. But we're America Firsters on this show,
That's right.
for sure, for real we are.
For real,
we're the real America Firsters, not those guys who are America first to blame.
Yeah, but there's something very toxic going on, and with that.
That's another podcast.
That's another podcast, and why not you and I to discuss it? Maybe we'll
really
set that one up.
For real.
Thanks, everyone, for culminating. Seeing the funny papers.